Pilipinosopos in the house.
Ngayong araw, iimbestigahan naman natin ang mga philosophical analysis ni Sir Acuña, particular ang mga formal deductive logic, informal logic, at theory of argument. Una muna natin pag-usapan ang subject of formal deductive logic. Ano nga ba ang formal deductive logic o mas kilala bilang FDL? Ang formal deductive logic o FDL ay nabigyan ng maraming kahulugan na nakabase sa iba't ibang logicians. Pero karaniwan, ang kahulugan nito ay it is the study of valid and invalid argument forms. Sinasabing nahanap ng mga formal logicians ang essence ng lahat ng arguments at ito raw ay nasa argument form nito. Dinidisregard nila ang content ng mga natural occurring arguments at instead, mas nagpo-focus sila sa logical form ng argument na kung saan sila nagbabase kung ang argument nga ba ay valid o hindi. Gamit tayo ng example para mas maintindihan pa natin ang FDL. Ito ay isang halimbawa ng deductive argument. Basahin natin saglit yung example. If Ian is a puppy, then Ian is a young dog. Ian is a puppy, therefore Ian is a young dog. Dito sa example na to, makikita natin na yung statements 1 and 2 ay premises at yung statement 3 naman ay conclusion na mula sa statements 1 and 2 natin. Ayon sa mga logicians, para maging argument ito, kailangan na may at least one premise and one conclusion ng argument. Maliban dyan, kailangan din na iisa lang conclusion kada argument kahit gaano pa karami ang premises nito. Panghuli, dapat dalawa lang ang truth values ng premises at conclusion, which is true or false lang. Yung ganitong structure ng argument ay tinatawag na modus ponens kung saan if P, then Q. P, therefore Q. Mapapansin nyo na wala namang sense yung content ng argument, pero this structure of argument is considered valid regardless of whatever its actual contents are. Pero paano naman kung if P, then Q, Q, therefore P? Yung ganoong structure naman ay tinatawag na affirming the consequent. Dito, kahit anong content pa rin ng argument ang ginamit, invalid pa rin ang argument dahil ito lang ang logical structure kung saan may combination na parehas na true ang premises pero false ang conclusion. Ayon yan sa mga formal logicians at sa kanilang truth table. At syempre, kung may formal logic at logicians, meron ding informal logic and logicians. Ano nga ba ang informal logic? Ayon kay Sir Acuña, informal logic is the logic that talks about how arguments occur in ordinary discourses rather than its logical form. So in short, mas nag-focus ito sa content ng arguments kaysa sa logical forms ito. Ayon nga kay Govier, formal logic by its very nature is very incompetent to address topics of controversy, disputed facts, plausible hypotheses, and analogies. Instead, we need to identify, understand, analyze, and evaluate arguments as they occur in the context of discourse in everyday discussion, conversation, controversy, and even debate. And of course, without the paradigm of logical form as template. Para mas maintindihan pa natin ang informal logic, tingnan natin yung example na ito. If it rains, ang dam will be full. Ang dam is full, therefore it rained. Even though invalid yung logical form niya, still, the content of the argument is valid kasi sinusuportahan ng maigi ng mga premises yung conclusion natin. Pero paano naman kung yung valid form ng modus ponens yung gamitin natin? Sa valid form, if it rains, ang dam will be full. It rained, therefore ang dam is full. Dito, ayon kay Sir Acuña, kahit valid yung logical form niya, invalid yung argument for the reason na the conclusion does not follow the premises. Paano? Yung context of discourse kasi ng it rained, pwedeng ambon lang ang nangyari. Umulan nga, pero sapat ba yung ulan para mapuno yung dam? Hindi, 'di ba? Kasi ambon lang. Balikan natin yung kanina nating example, tapos try natin ng naka-invalid form. If Ian is a puppy, then Ian is a young dog. Ian is a young dog, therefore Ian is a puppy. Kahit in-affirm natin yung consequent, still, the argument makes sense and is valid, kahit pa invalid yung logical form niya. Sige, try pa tayo isa. If ikaw si Cardilisay, then immortal ka. Immortal ka. Therefore, ikaw si Cardilisay. Ay, ba't ganun? Hindi naman nagme-make sense yung argument dahil hindi naman ako si Cardilisay. Ayan, nakalimutan nyo rin yung goal ng informal logic, no? Diba, sa informal logic, ang tinitingnan natin ay how arguments occur in ordinary discourses rather than its logical form. So, hindi natin pwede sabihin na tama ang logical form ng informal logic. Ayon kasi kay Johnson, informal logic is a designated branch of logic whose task is to develop non-formal standards, criteria, procedures for the analysis, interpretation, evaluation, criticism, and construction of argumentation in everyday discourse. So kung titingnan natin ulit yung content ng Angat Dam at Puppy argument, di ba madali natin mag-judge yung truth ng premises and conclusion in a non-deductive way? Ito ay dahil yung Puppy argument ay isang analytical argument at yung Angat Dam naman ay empirical argument. Mamaya, mas malalaman pa natin kung ano nga ba ang arguments na ito. So ayun nga, kahit sino naman sa atin, madali nating makikita at malalaman na totoo naman yung mga premises. At yung conclusion ng Angat Dam at Puppy argument ay sinusuportahan ng maigi ng kanilang mga premises. Pero na lang siguro kung nakagat ka ng formal logic bug, na logical form lang ng argument ang ginagamit mong basis sa validity ng isang argument. So, katulad nga ng sinabi ko kanina, hindi naman logical form kasi ang tinitingnan natin dito sa informal logic. Instead, ang tinitingnan natin dito ay yung non-deductive way in which premises confirm the truth of a conclusion. So in short, hindi naman talaga gustong i-prove ng mga informal logicians na invalid yung claims ng formal logic. Instead, gusto lang nila i-address yung imbalance ng formal logic being the basis of theory of argument. Pero parang hindi naman nga formal at informal logicians na nag-aaway-away. Kapwa informal logicians pa nga ata ang nag-aaway-away kasi marami silang hindi pagkakaintindihan. Isa na rito yung definition nila ng argument. Sinasabi kasi ng iba na ang argument is premise set plus logical inference plus conclusion, which is kinakagalit ng ibang informal logicians dahil hindi nga ba ang layunin nila is iwasan yung logical form ng isang argument. So bakit ginagamit ito ng ibang informal logicians bilang definition ng argument? Maliban sa definition of an argument, marami pang ibang tanong na pinaproblema ang mga informal logicians. Ilan dito ay yung, is deductive argument even an argument? How many arguments are there? Is the premise relevant to the conclusion? At how should a premise be related to the conclusion? Pero sabi nga ni Sir Acuña, we will never find the definition of an argument if we are to look for its essence in ordinary discourse. Instead, dapat sundin natin yung mga advice ni Wittgenstein na to look and see, don't think. Because otherwise, magagaya lang tayo sa mga formal logicians na sinasabing either your argument is deductive or else it is defective. At sisimulan na nga nating i-consider as counterfeit arguments yung mga non-deductive arguments.
Pero ano nga ba talaga yung argument? Ayon kay Sir Acuña, an argument is any discourse where some statements are used as reason, justification, or evidence in order to support the claim of another statement. Dagdag pa niya, the claim of the statement can be true or false, or probable, something good or bad, right or wrong, desirable or undesirable. So rito makikita natin na contrary ito sa logical deductive form which is excluded ang middle, or the third value na probability. And lastly, sinama niya sa definition of argument ang two main components nito, ang premise at conclusion. Sinabi niya na the premise is what supports the claim and conclusion is supported by the premises. Sinabi rin ni Sir Acuña that the practice of arguments is teleological, which means it focuses on purpose, goal, or end rather than a function of its cause. It helps us achieve different goals such as persuasion, justification, inquiry, belief maintenance, decision-making, and more. Ayon din kay Sir Acuña, may tatlong types of claims, ang empirical, analytical, and evaluative. Empirical arguments are arguments na may conclusion which claims that something is empirically true, false, or probable, and premises of it should provide evidence in order to verify the truth. This can be observation, studies, and even generalization pa pwede. Empirical argument also cannot admit a non-empirical premise. Premises should be relevant to the empirical claim. Kasi bakit ka nga naman gagamit ng non-empirical premise kung in the first place empirical ang argument mo? To better understand what an empirical argument is, basahin natin yung nasa example. Most politicians are corrupt because all the politicians I know are corrupt. Sa argument na ito, yung most politicians are corrupt ay yung claim natin. And ang premise naman ay yung because all the politicians I know are corrupt. Kung mapapansin nyo, yung premise natin is nagbigay ng evidence and that is through generalization. Sa analytic arguments naman, it is the argument where conclusion is making an analytic claim and it is supported by an analysis or definition. So rito karaniwan ang mga premises natin ay analytical definition ng ating mga claim. Basahin natin yung example. This piece of land must be triangle because it has 3 sides and 3 corners. Yung argument na ito ay makikita natin na analytical for the reason na yung premises natin ay analytical definition ng triangle, having 3 sides and 3 angles, which also supported our claim na triangular yung piece of land. Lastly, ang evaluative argument naman is the type of argument where conclusion claims that an act, behavior, or event is good or bad, right or wrong, moral or immoral, desirable or undesirable, and more. In short, nagbibigay tayo ng evaluation sa argument, kaya naman kadalasan ito yung mga moral, religious, and aesthetic arguments. Tulad sa example, it is immoral and sacrilegious to murder a human for pleasure because this is a violation of his or her human right. Currently, there is no known society or culture in the world that sanctions murder for pleasure. So, dito sa argument na ito, yung conclusion na it is immoral and sacrilegious to murder a human for pleasure, supported siya ng empirical at evaluative premise. Yung because this is a violation of his or her human right, ang yung evaluative premise niya. While yung there is no known society or culture in the world that sanctions murder for pleasure ay yung empirical premise ng argument because it shows evidence through observation or studies. To better criticize and compose an argument, nagpropose si Sir Acuña ng kanyang sketch of theory of argument through the model proposed by Ralph Johnson. In this model, makikita natin yung theory of analysis and appraisal. Sa theory of analysis, dito natin makikita yung mga previous nating pinag-usapan, yung definition and purpose of an argument. At syempre, yung typology of an argument, which is yung 3 types of argument na analytic, empirical, and evaluative. Pero ano yung theory of appraisal? Theory of appraisal aims to provide the criteria for judging the strength of support offered by the premise to the claim of the conclusion. So, ito naman pala yung magtuturo sa atin kung paano natin makikriticize ng better yung mga arguments. According sa theory of appraisal, in order for us to judge the strength of the support by the premise, we should identify first the nature of the claim. Is it analytic, empirical, or evaluative? After that, we should identify the required evidence to prove the claim of the conclusion. Pero, how do we determine if a premise is relevant or not to the conclusion? Ayon kay Sir Acuña, the premises must verify, confirm, and justify the claim of the conclusion. Dagdag pa niya, the stronger the support, the greater the relevance. So therefore, nagva-vary din yung relevance of premises in certain degrees. Combining all that we have learned, paano ba natin i-measure yung strength of arguments? Ang sagot ay, for every type of argument, we follow a certain standard. For example, to measure the strength of an empirical argument, we must measure the strength of its evidence provided. Nanggaling lang ba yung evidence from a generalization? Or did it come from an observation or study? For analytic arguments naman, we must have the stability of the truth of the analytic statement. Usually, ito yung mga analytic definitions. So, dito tinatanong natin kung may iba pa bang analytic definitions. And of course, pag mas konti, mas nagiging strong yung argument natin since the definition of it is closer to being the only definition of it. Lastly, to measure the strength of an evaluative argument, we must measure the extent of public acceptance or intersubjective consensus regarding the moral principle na binigay to justify the evaluative claim. Dito tinatanong natin kung marami bang nag-a-accept ng moral principle na ito. And of course, kapag mas marami, mas nagiging strong yung argument natin.